The flash of the magnesium powder burst through the small parlor, filling the air with a sharp, metallic haze. Henry Lowell Prentiss lowered the wooden lens cover, his hand trembling slightly as the smoke drifted upward toward the low ceiling beams. The heavy scent of collodion and ether clung to his clothes, mingling with the faint sweetness of decaying flowers that rested on the mantel. The house was silent except for the slow ticking of a brass clock and the faint creak of the floorboards beneath his boots. Before him, in a straight-backed chair draped with linen, sat the body of a child, Thomas Elcott, age 7. Prentiss had taken dozens of post-mortem portraits in his career. He told himself this would be no different. But something about this room, the stillness of it, felt unnatural. The boy's pale skin had a faint gray sheen, as if the cold had settled beneath it. His hands were folded neatly across his chest, fingertips just brushing the edge of a faded book placed for composure. The mother stood in the doorway, unable to speak, her hand pressed tightly over her mouth. Prentiss avoided her gaze. He had long learned that pity only made the work harder. He adjusted the camera's brass knob, checking the alignment through the viewfinder. The old Dallmeyer lens caught the reflection of his own eyes, small, tired, rimmed red from lack of sleep. "All right," he murmured softly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Hold still now." The absurdity of the phrase struck him, but the habit was unshakable. He uncapped the lens again. The exposure took only seconds. The faint hum of life outside, the wind, the distant rumble of a passing cart, feeling unbearably loud in contrast. When he replaced the cap, he noticed something strange. A thin line of condensation had formed inside the lens glass, faint but visible. He frowned. The temperature in the room was cold, yes, but steady. He'd photographed in worse conditions without issue. Prentiss set the first plate aside to develop later and prepared a second. As he reached for the camera's focusing cloth, a slight sound reached him. Not a creak, not the shift of a board, but something softer. A breath, shallow and uncertain. He froze, hand mid-air. His gaze moved slowly to the child. The boy's head rested exactly where it had been, chin slightly lowered. But for an instant, only an instant, Prentiss could have sworn the eyelids fluttered. He blinked hard, dismissing it. "Fatigue," he muttered under his breath, though his pulse thudded uncomfortably in his ears. He leaned forward to recheck the pose. The waxen face remained still, unchanged. He tightened the focus again, fingers unsteady. "Just one more plate," he said aloud, his voice thin in the quiet. The second exposure was nearly complete when he felt a tremor beneath his boots. Barely perceptible, perhaps a passing cart again, or settling earth. He steadied the camera and counted the seconds. At precisely 15, he replaced the cap. The room returned to silence. Satisfied, he carried the plates to his portable dark box by the window. The mother had slipped away into the adjoining hall, muffling her sobs. He poured the developer solution across the glass, watching the image begin to surface in swirls of gray and silver. The first plate emerged just as expected. The child, serene, eyes closed, lips parted slightly as if mid-breath. He rinsed it gently in the wash basin, but when he placed the second plate under the red lamp, the breath caught in his throat. The boy's eyes were open. Not wide, not startled, just open enough that the pupils caught the faint glint of light. They were turned, ever so slightly, toward the camera. Toward him. Prentiss stepped back, the edge of the basin striking his hip. "No," he whispered. "That's not—" He compared both plates side by side, his trembling hands leaving faint streaks of chemical residue along the glass edges. The difference was undeniable. The child had moved. Not an inch, not a limb, only the eyes. But it was movement nonetheless, impossible and deliberate. He looked toward the chair again. The boy sat motionless, unchanged, the small chest still sunken where life had once filled it. Prentiss felt a chill creep through his body, settling into the marrow of his bones. His logical mind began searching for answers. Temperature shift, chemical reaction, exposure flaw, but none aligned with what he saw before him. Collodion plates did not lie. A creak echoed from the floorboards behind him. He turned sharply, expecting the mother, but the doorway was empty. The wind outside groaned through the chimney, carrying a faint whispering sound that could almost have been words. His throat tightened. The clock ticked on, steady and indifferent. He wrapped the plates quickly, slipping them into their storage case with clumsy precision. His heart raced, a cold sweat breaking along his neck. Perhaps he would check the negatives again at his studio, under proper conditions, proper light. Yes, that was it. A trick of the lamplight. He'd convince himself of that, because the alternative made no sense at all. Before leaving, Prentiss cast one last look toward the chair. The boy's head seemed lower than before, chin nearly touching his chest. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fatigue from his vision. "It's just the shadows," he whispered. Still, he stepped backward through the doorway rather than turning his back to the figure. Outside, the cold spring air hit his lungs like ice. He paused at the gate, gripping the metal latch until his knuckles whitened. The fog from the nearby marsh crept low across the ground, curling around his boots as though reluctant to let him go. That night, he developed the final positives in his shed studio. When he held them under lamplight, he saw it again. The same deliberate shift, the unmistakable direction of gaze. The eyes that had been closed were now open. The boy was looking straight into the lens, straight into him. Prentiss sat back, breath shallow. The lamp flickered once, then steadied. In the silence that followed, he thought he heard the faint sound of breathing, not his own, echoing from the shadows beyond the developing table. He left the plates to dry and stepped outside, unable to stay in the same room. The night air was colder than before, biting at his face. He stood under the pale moonlight for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what he had witnessed. Every rational explanation dissolved into mist before his eyes. When dawn came, he returned inside. The plates, now dry, gleamed faintly in the early light. He placed them side by side one last time. The boy's gaze met his again through the translucent glass, unblinking, watchful, aware. His voice trembled as he whispered into the empty room. "What you're about to hear," the narrator says, "is why no one could ever explain how he looked back." The smell of ether and varnish hung thick in the air that morning when Henry Lowell Prentiss arranged the child's body on the parlor chair. Light from the small frost-fogged window fell in narrow bands across the lace collar, the boots, the still hands folded neatly over the chest. Outside, a weak March wind rattled the bare elm branches against the roof of the converted carriage shed that served as his studio. Prentiss moved carefully, his fingers trembling slightly as he adjusted the camera's bellows and leveled the tripod. The silence inside was so heavy it felt alive, a silence that seemed to listen. "Hold steady now," he muttered, though there was no one to hear him. The child's name, written on the tag tied around the wrist, read Thomas Elcott. His parents had already gone, unable to bear witness to the session. They had left behind a small payment and a single request: make him look peaceful. Prentiss had done such work before, enough to dull the horror, never enough to erase it. The faint metallic taste of the collodion mixture clung to his throat as he coated the glass plate. He counted under his breath: 1, 2, 3, then drew the dark slide and opened the shutter. The hum of the outside wind faded. He swore he heard something like a sigh escape the child's lips. His pulse quickened. A trick of air, he told himself. He closed the lens and slid the plate back into the holder. The exposure complete, he exhaled shakily. When he developed the first plate, the image appeared just as expected. Closed eyes, soft focus, the gentle blur of motionless peace. He nodded once and prepared for a second exposure, adjusting the drape and wiping condensation from the lens. But as he leaned closer, the air around him thickened. A faint vibration tremored through the floorboards, enough to ripple the basin of developer solution. Prentiss hesitated. The wet collodion required quick work. Delay would ruin the emulsion. He steadied his hands, muttering to himself, "One more plate, Henry. Just one more." He opened the shutter again. The ticking of his pocket watch filled the silence. 10 seconds passed. Then 15. He closed the lens, sealed the plate, and turned toward the developing basin. The light in the room dimmed as if a cloud had rolled over the sun. When the image surfaced on the glass, his stomach clenched. The boy's eyes, closed moments before, were now half open, the pupils faint but visible, centered toward the camera. Prentiss stepped back, breath caught in his throat. He examined the plate under the red lamp again. There was no mistaking it. The child's eyes had moved. The lamp flickered once, twice before steadied by his trembling hand. His mind raced through explanations. Error in exposure, chemical distortion, mechanical misalignment. Yet none satisfied the creeping dread that crawled under his skin. "Impossible," he whispered. "Utterly impossible." The word echoed through the small room like a confession. That night, Prentiss sat alone in his quarters behind the studio, staring at the 2 plates propped against the wall. The first, eyes closed. The second, eyes open. His apprentice, Elias Porter, a quiet youth of 18, knocked softly before entering. "Sir, are you all right?" "I heard something fall earlier." Prentiss gestured him inside, voice hollow. "Look at these, Elias." "Tell me what you see." Elias leaned forward under the lamplight, squinting. "They're different, sir." "The second one. The boy's looking right at you." The older man's expression darkened. He was dead, Elias. Cold to the touch. There was no twitch, no movement. He rubbed his temples. "Something's wrong with the emulsion." "Has to be." They rechecked every measurement, aperture, focal distance, chemical proportions. Nothing was amiss. When Elias lifted the plate toward the light, a faint black halo shimmered around the child's eyes, as though the silver had burned itself there. The next morning, Prentiss walked to the telegraph office on Main Street, his coat collar drawn up against the wind. He sent a brief message to a fellow photographer in Worcester. Strange reaction. Subject unmoving. Eyes appear altered between plates. "Have you seen such thing?" The clerk glanced curiously at the message before transmitting it. By the week's end, no reply had come. Instead, Prentiss found himself haunted by whispers. Mrs. Darnell, who cleaned the studio, claimed she saw movement in the reflection of the camera lens when she dusted the parlor. Porter began refusing to enter the darkroom alone. "It hums," the boy said one evening, shivering as he stood by the doorway. "Like there's breathing behind the wall." Prentiss dismissed him sharply but felt the same unease. At night he heard the boards creak under soft, measured steps. Once he woke to find the plates on his desk rearranged, the second exposure lying face up. In the faint moonlight, the boy's glassy eyes seemed alive. Driven by a need for answers, he visited the Elcott home to speak with the child's father. The man, gaunt and pale, met him at the door. "We buried him 2 days after you took those photographs," Mr. Elcott said quietly. "We heard nothing since." Prentiss hesitated, his mouth dry. "Forgive the intrusion, but when you left, did you notice any?" He stopped himself. "Never mind." The man frowned. "Any what, Mr. Prentiss?" "Nothing," he said finally, forcing a strained smile. "Just making sure the family received their prints." But as he turned to leave, he glimpsed something through the window, one of the prints propped on the mantel. The faintest shimmer flickered in the reflection of its glass. A candle guttered, and the image seemed to shift, though it might have been the flame's movement. That night he made one final note in his ledger. Child, male, deceased, 3 plates attempted. 2 eyes moved. Then, below it, in darker ink, a trembling scrawl. Do not attempt a 4th. By morning, Henry Lowell Prentiss was gone. The studio door hung open, the fire cold, the plates missing from the drying rack. Only his ledger remained, damp from the leaking roof and smudged with fingerprints that matched neither his nor Elias Porter's. The telegraph clerk, recalling that day, said Prentiss looked as if he'd seen something no man should. No obituary ever appeared, no sale notice, no will, no trace of family followed. The studio stood empty for years until a new tenant converted it into a feed store. In 1903, the parish register made a curious note. On this ground once stood the Prentiss Place. Reflection there said to blink, locals began to speak of a curse, the Prentiss curse, they called it, claiming that mirrors left overnight in the old building sometimes showed faces that weren't there by morning. Men laughed at the stories, though none stayed past dusk. Children dared each other to press their hands to the cracked studio window to see if the glass felt colder than the air. It always did. Historians would later dismiss it as hysteria born of morning. Yet every investigation, every skeptical eye, returned to the same unsolved fact. The plates didn't match. The room was silent except for the faint hiss of the collodion drying on glass. Henry Lowell Prentiss leaned over the camera's ground glass plate, breath shallow, eyes fixed on the still form of the child before him. The parlor smelled faintly of ether and old roses, the remnants of whatever comfort the grieving mother had left behind. Light filtered through lace curtains in narrow bands, cutting across the boy's pale face where the last touch of warmth had long departed. Prentiss adjusted the brass focus ring, steady and precise, as he had done hundreds of times before. But this session was different. He could feel it in his bones, a heaviness that seemed to settle in the air around him. Hold. Still, he murmured out of habit, though no living ear could hear him. His assistant, Elias Porter, stood by the chemicals table, the silver bath glinting in the low light. Elias had seen his master work on dozens of post-mortem portraits, yet something about this one made his skin crawl. The boy's eyelids, sealed shut in perfect repose, seemed too peaceful, too deliberate. Prentiss lifted the cap from the lens. The room went still, time suspended between the click of light and the whisper of exposure. 1, 2, 3 seconds passed. Then he capped it again. The plate was quickly carried to the corner where the developing tray waited, the glass sliding beneath the fluid with a soft hiss. The image emerged like a secret from beneath the liquid surface. Elias leaned closer. "It's clear," he whispered. The figure of the boy appeared crisp, small boots, folded hands, a lace collar, and those closed lids. Perfect stillness. Prentiss nodded once, jotting the time, 11:43 a.m., March 22, 1875. "Exposure A," he said under his breath. He prepared the second plate, coating it swiftly in collodion, his hand steady but his mind uneasy. "Let's take one more," he said, voice lower now. Elias hesitated. The mother said 3 were enough. Prentiss didn't look up. "We'll take a second." Lights changing. The child hadn't moved. The curtains fluttered slightly with the morning breeze, but the camera stood unmoved on its tripod, the brass legs anchored into the floorboards. Prentiss uncapped the lens once more, 11:44 a.m. The light struck again, bouncing off pale flesh and glass. For a moment, the air seemed thicker, as if the whole house inhaled and held its breath. Then the exposure was done. As Prentiss developed the second plate, Elias stood beside him, arms folded, eyes darting between his master's furrowed brow and the murky liquid. The image appeared slowly, first the outline, then the hands, the folds of the small jacket, the delicate curve of the face. Then Elias froze. "Sir, look." Prentiss leaned closer. The boy's eyelids were no longer closed. They were faintly parted, the pupils centered, staring directly toward the lens. For several seconds neither man spoke. Only the sound of the developing fluid trickling over glass filled the silence. "That," Elias began, voice cracking, "that can't be right." The head didn't move. "You saw?" "I saw," Prentiss interrupted sharply, but his tone carried more fear than authority. He lifted the plate toward the window, the diffused daylight spilling across the child's face. The image shimmered faintly as if resisting the light. "Could be the chemicals," Prentiss muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. He rubbed his thumb along the edge of the glass. "We'll take one more, just to be certain." Elias stepped back. "Sir, the plates were cleaned properly. There's no chance of double exposure." His voice trembled, his throat tight. "It looks like he opened his eyes." Prentiss turned to him slowly. "Enough, Elias." But the older man's face betrayed what his words denied. His gaze lingered on the portrait, the faint dark halo forming around the boy's eyes, chemical blackening, deep and uneven. It looked almost burned. That night, long after the child's body had been taken from the parlor, Elias returned to the studio. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight. The developing tray still reeked of silver nitrate. He lit a single lantern and lifted both plates side by side on the table. Exposure A. Eyes closed, peaceful. Exposure B. Eyes open, unblinking. The difference was unmistakable. He thought of the temperature, barely 41 degrees that morning. Too cold for emulsion warping. Too mild for any chemical blooming. He examined the camera again. A Dallmeyer rapid rectilinear, tripod locked, lens clean. No movement, no drafts, no chance of the glass shifting mid-shot. As he leaned closer to the second plate, he noticed something else, the faint scent of smoke. The emulsion had blackened not just near the pupils but radiated outward in thin, smoky veins. Elias ran his finger along the edge of the glass, and when he lifted it, the tip was stained gray. He heard a sound then, a faint creak, like pressure shifting within the walls. He froze, the lantern flame flickering as though a draft had passed through the sealed room. For a moment, he thought he saw the reflection of movement in the boy's eyes on the plate. A trick of light, surely, but it sent a chill crawling up his spine. The next morning, when Prentiss returned, Elias stood waiting, the plates on the table between them. "Mr. Prentiss," he said quietly, "I'm telling you what I saw." It wasn't light or chemical error. He blinked. "You said you saw it too." Prentiss said nothing. He looked at the plates, then at Elias. "Do not repeat that," he said at last, voice low, almost pleading. "If you value your place here, you'll forget it." Elias hesitated. "Sir, people will ask about the dark spots. The mother might." "I'll retouch them," Prentiss said quickly, but his hands shook as he picked up the glass. The chemical stain had eaten into the image itself, circling each eye like a smoldered ring. That afternoon, Elias noted something strange in the ledger. Beneath child, male, deceased, 3 plates attempted, Prentiss had added a line in different ink. 2 eyes moved. Years later, when Elias was interviewed by a regional paper, he would still remember the smell of that morning. The ether, the smoke, and the faint sweetness of the flowers beside the child's head. He would recall the way Prentiss dropped the plate that night, swearing the child blinked, and how the glass smoked black around the eyes. The chemical blackening remains visible even now under ultraviolet examination. Every expert who has studied it agrees. No mechanical movement could have caused such precise ocular shift within 1 minute. The camera had been fixed with a tripod bolt, the parlor sealed tight, the air still. The evidence pointed to one impossible truth. "The motion came from within the subject," wrote Porter, "not the lens." The faint hum of the spectrophotometer filled the dimly lit examination room as Professor Alaric Venn leaned closer to the glass plate, his gloved fingers steady over the fragile negative. The device, a Thomson spectrophotometer imported from London, emitted a thin beam of white light that sliced across the table, refracting through the cracked emulsion of the century-old photograph. On the opposite wall, the projected spectrum shimmered faintly, bands of violet and blue shifting with each slow adjustment of the machine's brass dial. Venn exhaled softly, the sound loud in the silence. The reading fluctuated again, a faint irregularity pulsing at the edges of the iris. He noted it with precision, his handwriting sharp and deliberate. Silver density fluctuation, localized, he murmured to himself. Unpatterned, but rhythmic. He straightened and rubbed the bridge of his nose. The plate before him showed the same child, the one whose eyes had defied death. The collodion surface still glimmered faintly under the lamplight, its sheen like oil over calm water. Around him, the Massachusetts Historical Optics Society's archive smelled of dust, iron, and aging chemicals. Rows of preserved equipment lined the walls, lenses in velvet boxes, faded ledgers, half-empty bottles of ether and potassium cyanide. Yet it was this one plate that consumed him. For days, Venn had lived in this room, sleeping on the narrow cot beside the dark-room door, convinced that the answer was hidden in the silver itself. At precisely midnight, the light in the spectrophotometer flickered. Venn's eyes snapped open. He leaned forward as the spectrum began to tremble, the colors vibrating as if disturbed by a faint sound. He held his breath. The pulse intensified. 3 waves, evenly spaced, emanating from the section marked "Iris left." He wrote again, but his pen trembled. "Frequency modulation present," he whispered. "Auditory interference?" He turned off the device, but the vibration persisted, a low hum echoing through the tabletop. When the machine finally fell silent, he stood motionless for several seconds, listening. The silence returned heavier than before, pressing against his ears. He glanced toward the plate again. The boy's eyes, those cold, motionless eyes, seemed slightly altered under the new angle of the lamp. Venn told himself it was fatigue. He had been awake for nearly 30 hours, but as he stared longer, the reflection in the pupils seemed to shimmer, faintly warping like water disturbed by breath. Later that night, he locked the lab and left his notes sealed in a drawer labeled Experiment 12B, Prentiss Plates. In his report the following morning, he wrote, "The effect resembles a secondary exposure overlapping the first." Yet, even as he tried to justify it, the impossibility gnawed at him. There were no ghosted outlines, no misaligned shadows, only that uncanny precision in the eyes, as though something inside the plate had looked back when light struck it. 2 decades later, the mystery returned to the surface. Dr. Miriam Keld, a meticulous curator with a fondness for unsolved anomalies, reopened Venn's sealed crate in 1947. The archive had long been relocated to a larger facility near Cambridge, its halls cold and silent except for the echo of her footsteps. When she unwrapped the old glass negatives, she found Venn's handwriting still intact, the ink faded but legible. She smiled faintly. "You chased ghosts, Professor," she said under her breath, sliding the first plate into the X-ray chamber. The machine whirred to life with a hollow hum. Keld adjusted her lead apron and focused on the screen as the image began to emerge. At first, it appeared ordinary, thin lines of varying density marking the outline of the child's face. But then she noticed something strange. Tiny concentric fissures radiating outward from the eyes. They were too symmetrical to be random cracks, too delicate to be caused by heat or stress. She increased the magnification, heart pounding softly in her chest. The rings deepened, spiraling inward until they nearly met at the pupil's edge. They reminded her of ripples in a pond disturbed by a pebble, perfectly spaced, caught mid-motion. She stepped back, suddenly aware of the chill in the room. "Vibration traces," she murmured, as if sound rippled through the emulsion. She removed her gloves and touched the edge of the glass. It felt unnaturally cold. Later that evening, as she filed her observations, she overheard 2 custodians speaking near the doorway. One of them, a thin man with a worn accent, gestured toward the foundation of the old building. "You know this place sits on a mine shaft," he said. "Old tunnel from 1819, sealed but hollow. They say you can still hear the ground groan when it rains." Keld paused, curiosity replacing unease. She retrieved the town's survey map and confirmed it. The archive indeed rested above a decommissioned iron mine. The coincidence unsettled her. The next day, she descended with the caretaker, lantern in hand, through a maintenance corridor that opened to the old shaft. The air grew heavy, tinged with minerals and earth. Wooden supports lined the walls, brittle and cracked with age. As she stepped deeper, a faint echo reached her ears. It was rhythmic at first, then irregular, like breathing filtered through stone. She froze. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. The caretaker frowned. "Wind, ma'am." "Comes through the vents." But she wasn't so sure. When she returned to the surface, she sealed the crate once more, labeling it with Ven's original mark. That night she wrote in her field journal, "The vibrations cannot be explained by natural stress or temperature. There is resonance in the material itself." Her final line underlined twice. Every test deepened the riddle. None dispelled it. Professor Alaric Venn stood in the dim laboratory of Westbridge College, the air heavy with the scent of developer fluid and dusted glass. The two plates lay before him beneath the magnifier, their surfaces trembling faintly in the vibration of the ceiling fan. For the third time that morning, he adjusted the focus, tracing the faint silver pattern that surrounded each iris. "Impossible," he murmured, leaning closer until his breath fogged the lens. The plates, taken 80 years apart from his own life, reflected more than the face of a dead child. They seemed to contain motion, arrested mid-thought. He recorded his findings carefully, his pen scratching against the parchment ledger. "Silver density appears to follow organic contour," he wrote, "no sign of emulsion warping." Outside, the afternoon rain lashed against the narrow windows, casting fractured patterns of light across the desk. To anyone else, the markings might have seemed like random decay, age, humidity, or careless handling. But to Venn, who had devoted his career to the mathematics of exposure and optical precision, the curvature of the lines was too deliberate. It followed the sweep of an eye turning toward something unseen. When his assistant, a thin, anxious man named Peter Lang, entered with a steaming kettle, Venn didn't look up. "Sir," Lang began hesitantly, "if you stare at it that long, you'll start to see anything you wish to see." "I don't wish to see," Venn replied quietly. "I measure." He adjusted the focus again, his hand steady but his voice betraying the faint tremor of obsession. "There's no error here, Lang. This is not chemical drift. The shift is anatomical." Lang swallowed hard. "Then it would mean the subject moved," Venn said sharply, cutting him off. The words hung in the air, absurd yet undeniable. The faint ticking of the wall clock filled the silence that followed. Over the next several nights, Venn performed test after test. He replicated the same collodion formula used in 1875, mixed precisely by weight, and photographed a wooden mannequin under identical conditions. None of the results showed the same density fluctuation around the eyes. Exhausted and irritable, he wrote letters to colleagues across the country, demanding alternate explanations. Only one responded, Inspector Hadley, a retired investigator who had reviewed the Prentiss materials decades earlier. When Hadley arrived at the college, his gait was slow, but his eyes were sharp with that unmistakable curiosity of men who have spent their lives in pursuit of secrets. "Professor Venn," he greeted, removing his hat, "I see you've met the boy who doesn't blink." Venn managed a tired smile. "You sound as though you believe the legend." "I don't believe in legends," Hadley replied, taking a seat across from him. "Only in the things people try too hard to disprove." Together, they studied the plates beneath the sterile light. Hadley examined the logbook, tracing the faint scrawl of Henry Prentiss's last entry. Two eyes moved. The words had been written in a hand less steady than the rest, as though pressed by trembling fingers. What if it wasn't movement? Hadley mused. What if Prentiss replaced the child, brought in a living one for the second plate to sell a miracle to the grieving family? Venn turned toward him, offended by the simplicity of the suggestion. Fraud? He asked. A photographer of his reputation. Reputation means little when hunger sets in, Hadley said evenly. He lived alone, took odd jobs. People said he was desperate. Near the end, Venn retrieved a brittle parish record from the shelf and laid it flat between them. Thomas Elcott, he read aloud, buried March 20th. The second exposure was made on the 22nd. The coffin was sealed with lead nails. Even if Prentiss had wanted to stage a substitution, there was no child to substitute. Hadley frowned. Then your only other explanation is impossible. Not impossible, Venn said quietly. Only unproven. For hours they debated the limits of photography and physics, voices rising and falling like waves against the stone walls. As the evening deepened, the room grew colder. The glass plates, now illuminated by a single gas lamp, seemed almost alive, the eyes faintly luminous in the half-dark. At one point, Hadley leaned closer, squinting. Does it seem, he asked, that they look back differently depending on where you stand? Venn exhaled through his nose, half in irritation, half in awe. That's a parallax illusion. The emulsion depth tricks the eye. Yet when he shifted his own position, a chill ran down his spine. The pupils did seem to realign. It was subtle, like the turning of a clock's hand between blinks. They left the lab after midnight, the lamps extinguished behind them. Neither man spoke of what they saw in that last flicker of light, the faint shimmer near the eyes, as though something beneath the glass had stirred. Weeks passed, and Venn's obsession grew. The correspondence with Hadley ended abruptly. The inspector had fallen ill and refused further interviews. In his solitude, Venn turned to the writings of the Aldrich Society for Psychic Optics, a small but persistent group of scholars who believed that light could reawaken fragments of human awareness. Their letters were half scientific, half mystical, filled with diagrams of vital residue and memory imprint fields. Against his better judgment, Venn invited one of their senior members, Dr. Aldrich Moreau, to examine the plates. Moreau arrived one autumn evening, his coat lined with chemical stains, his hands shaking from years of mercury exposure. "You see, Professor," he said as he placed a portable galvanic lamp beside the plates, "what you call exposure, we call communion. The emulsion is not passive. It remembers Venn's rational mind rejected the claim, yet something in Moreau's conviction unsettled him. When the doctor switched on his lamp, the plates glowed faintly, the silver beneath the surface shimmering like water. "Residual vitality," Moreau whispered, "a last awareness caught between light and decay." The words struck Venn more deeply than he cared to admit. That night, after Moreau left, he returned to the darkroom alone. He adjusted the lamp to the same setting and watched the plates through a magnifier. His reflection hovered faintly in the glass, a ghost layered over another. The eyes of the child, soft, weary, almost human, seemed to follow his motion. He told himself it was fatigue, a trick of persistence of vision. But when he turned away, he felt the distinct pressure of being observed. By morning, Venn could no longer dismiss the phenomenon as coincidence. He compiled his notes into a single report titled "Anomalous Silver Distribution in Historical Collodion Plates." The final paragraph was unlike anything else he had written. If consciousness leaves an after-image, then photography may be its mirror. He sealed the document and sent it to the Massachusetts Historical Optics Society. Years later, during the restoration of the collection in 1962, a restorer named Harlan Bryce found a note attached to the report in Venn's own hand. It contained only one line, written in hurried graphite. Movement verified in both positive and negative. Bryce recorded the words in the archive index without interpretation. To this day, no test has disproved Venn's findings. The chemical shifts remain localized to the eyes. The density still follows an impossible contour. Whether born of science, illusion, or something in between, the plates continue to hold their secret, the faint impression of awareness trapped in silver and light. Each explanation collapsed where the gaze began, the archivist wrote. The vibration began before Harlan Bryce noticed the temperature change. At first, it was only a tremor in the glass tray, a gentle ripple across the developer fluid, barely enough to disturb the chemical's mirror surface. He leaned closer, squinting under the dim red safe light, unaware that the clock above the darkroom sink had just ticked past 3:17 a.m. The air smelled of ether and vinegar, sharp and metallic, burning faintly at the back of his throat. His breath left tiny clouds against the cool air as he steadied the tray with both hands. "Easy now," he murmured to himself, voice trembling in the small, sealed room. The Grafton Archive's basement was silent apart from the hum of the ventilation fan and the rhythmic drip from a leaky pipe somewhere behind him. The floor was concrete, cold and slightly uneven, and beneath his boots he felt a faint tremor that didn't belong to any machine. He glanced toward the drying rack. The plate rested upright under its glass hood, faint outlines beginning to form. He could already make out the boy's small frame, the lace collar, and the pale oval of his face. The child from 1875. The one everyone whispered about but no one dared to study alone. Bryce told himself he wasn't superstitious, he was a technician, not a believer. But as the light flickered and the cold deepened, that conviction began to waver. The thermometer pinned to the wall dropped another few degrees, its red line sinking like blood draining from a wound. His fingers, damp from the developer, left streaks on the edge of the counter as he reached for the lamp switch. The bulb flickered once, twice, then steadied again, but the tray continued to vibrate, harder now, sending fine ripples outward in perfect concentric rings. Then he saw it. The child's eyes, half-shadowed under the faint emulsion wash, were closed at first. But as Bryce leaned closer, a thin seam of light broke through them, like slits widening. The pupils appeared, two dark, deliberate centers fixed within the ghostly blur of the face. For a moment, he thought his own reflection had distorted the plate, but as he adjusted his angle, the eyes turned. Slowly, precisely, toward him. Bryce's chest tightened. He stumbled back, bumping against the sink, his breath catching in disbelief. "No, that's not possible," he whispered. His voice echoed faintly off the concrete walls, too loud in the small room. The eyes remained locked on him. They were not lifeless glass or accidental shadow, they were aware. The expression that once held solemn stillness now carried faint curiosity, almost as if the boy were awakening from a long sleep. A dull click came from behind him, the sound of the light switch snapping off on its own. The red glow died instantly, plunging the room into a suffocating darkness. Bryce's heartbeat thundered in his ears. The smell of ether grew thicker, sharper, as though the chemicals themselves were reacting to something unseen. "Who's there?" he demanded, turning toward the door. His hands searched for the switch, but the wall felt slick beneath his fingers, coated with condensation. The air pressure seemed to shift. His ears popped painfully, and the vibration from the tray had become a low hum that resonated through the floor. A faint glimmer appeared ahead, silver light bleeding through the plate's glass edges, flickering like candle flame trapped within. He took a step closer, each footfall echoing strangely long. The boy's face was no longer faint. It was sharp now, rendered in impossible clarity. The texture of his hair, the smooth curve of his cheeks, the faint shadow under his collar, every detail alive with unnatural precision. And the eyes, those terrible eyes, had moved again. This time they stared directly at him. Bryce froze. He could feel his pulse in his throat, his breath coming shallow and quick. The sensation wasn't fear at first, it was recognition, as though the child knew him, or worse, was studying him. He tried to look away but couldn't. The darkness around the plate thickened, swallowing the edges of the room until only the portrait remained visible, suspended in that cold glow. The hum deepened into a steady, low frequency that seemed to vibrate inside his bones. Objects on the counter began to rattle, metal tongs, bottles, the glass beaker rolling toward the edge. Then came the sound, a faint whisper, so low he thought it might be the ventilation system. But it formed a shape, a breath that carried something close to a word. He couldn't tell what it said, only that it came from the plate itself. Bryce's courage broke. He reached for the light switch again, clawing at the wall. His fingertips scraped plaster. The bulb flashed once, flooding the room with harsh white light, and for a fraction of a second he saw the impossible. The boy's reflection no longer confined to the plate but standing beside it, a translucent outline with the same turned gaze, same folded hands, only now its lips were parted slightly as if about to speak. He stumbled backward, knocking over the tray. The liquid splashed across the floor, black and viscous, spreading like a shadow reaching for his boots. He bolted for the door, flinging it open so hard it struck the adjacent wall with a hollow crack. When the security guard found him minutes later in the hallway, Bryce was trembling uncontrollably, his face pale, his voice fractured. "It looked at me," he kept repeating. "It looked right at me." Inside the dark room, the light burned steadily again. The photograph sat undisturbed on the drying rack. The child's eyes returned to their original position, downcast, calm, lifeless. But on the lower corner of the negative, 2 thumbprints glistened faintly under the chemical residue. Later analysis confirmed they did not belong to Harlan Bryce. The incident report filed the next morning cited equipment malfunction and operator fatigue. But those who entered the room afterward spoke of a lingering chill, as if the air itself carried a memory of that night. Within months, the Grafton Archive Board voted unanimously to seal the entire Prentiss collection until further notice. No explanation was printed, no press statement released. For decades, the boxes sat in climate-controlled silence, their labels fading, their history forgotten. When they were finally reopened in 2008, a graduate researcher digitizing the old plates noticed something disturbing. Across 3 separate post-mortem portraits from the same region, identical iris distortions appeared. The alignment, the curvature, even the faint black ring of emulsion perfectly matched. No one could explain it. Some dismissed it as photographic decay. Others whispered of residual vitality once more. But a handful of archivists, those who had seen the scans in person, spoke quietly of another phenomenon. "If you stand long enough before the scan," one curator warns, "the eyes adjust to yours." If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe and turn on notifications for the next file. Disclaimer: this script is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, institutions, and incidents are invented or used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental, created solely for entertainment.